What does the future hold? Wow, what a question to ask ourselves, especially at this time. And yeah, who knew at the beginning of the year when I chose this topic, what kind of situation we would find ourselves in, and how much the world would have changed since then, since the beginning of the year. So yeah, hugely relevant and very important that we discuss this further. So let's dive right into this. I'm recording this on Earth Day, so the 22nd of April, which I think is pretty fitting coincidence because the first Earth Day took place in 1970, and that means that today is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So this is an ideal point to ask ourselves, where are we now, and what have we done in these last 50 years? What's happened to the world, and what does that mean in terms of transitioning, with the topic transitioning to a sustainable future, and asking, wow, we've 50 years, where are we, and yeah, what does that mean for our future? A little bit of the roadmap for the presentation. I'm going to start a little bit with the climate crisis and kind of framing that whole concept of transitioning to a sustainable future, why it's been so difficult, and what we can do to address that. And that dives into the topic of climate change denial and cognitive dissonance. Then moving on to climate justice, and then a big chunk will also focus on COVID-19, because we can't talk about our future and what's happening without taking that into the current context of COVID-19, and discussing, how's that is that maybe part of the wake-up call, paradigm shift, and then discussing a little bit of the solutions in terms of post-COVID economy and planet politics, the end of IR, which is one of the papers that was subscribed for this week's reading, and then ending with a conclusion on what now, and yeah, what's the way forward, and what's the future. Okay, the climate crisis. Yeah, I mean, we're finding ourselves in very uncertain times, in very difficult times, in a time of climate crises, in a time where climate change has already progressed, and it's progressed a lot faster than previously scientists have predicted. We're experiencing burning rainforests, more bushfires, droughts, increased air pollution, ocean acidification, coral bleaching, some really horrific problems in the world. And yeah, kind of just carrying on and pretending that this isn't a crisis, or we're not really treating it like a crisis, which is problematic, and that kind of leads me to the question of why is that? Why is it that climate change has been known and discussed for at least the last 50 years? I mean, this is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And what have we done? We've talked about climate change, yeah, sure. It's been debated, but it's been stimulated, it's been, yeah, but it's not, nothing's been implemented to really prepare us for a global problem. Yeah, and we'll also discuss that. I'll discuss that a little bit more in relation to COVID, and how COVID actually teaches us how little our global systems are prepared for global pandemics and global problems and global challenges. Yeah. But we need to discuss climate change denial, because climate change denial has been a key factor that has contributed to climate change being a debate and not being taken as seriously as it should have been. And the origins of climate change denial lie particularly within the US and within industries and conservative think tanks, which have formed as a result of it, and which is formed because industries realize, well, if public opinion and consensus around climate change increases and takes form in order to actually completely change the way we're living on Earth, then that will have consequences for the industry, that will have consequences for profits, and yeah, obviously that's something that the fossil fuel industry wants to avoid at all costs. So very think tanks were formed, and there is funding in terms of for climate change denial, which is hugely problematic. So yeah, big players in that have been the Koch brothers, the Koch brothers, and also Exxon, as well as other fossil fuel companies, which have funded scientists, well-known figures to speak about climate change as to spread fake news around climate change, and to present climate change as a debate rather than a scientific consensus. And the fact that it's originated and it's very much rooted also in the US can still be seen. It's still seen the cultural differences between how climate change is addressed, and that's particularly problematic in a global system where the US acts as a world hegemon and is a hugely powerful country. So yeah, that also kind of that cultural difference was mirrored when Greta Thunberg visited the US, and she was invited to Trevor Noah's Daily Show, and Trevor Noah asked her in terms of has she realized that there's a difference between the discussions around climate change in Sweden compared to the US, and she said, yeah, here, so in the US, it is being discussed as something you believe or not believe in, and where I come from, it is a fact. And yeah, I think that pinpoints the whole difficulty around climate change denial pretty well, because it's just strange to think how much public perception fake news has been spread around that climate change is not believed as a scientific fact, whereas 99% of scientists agree that climate change is human-induced. Yeah. But then why is it so difficult to address climate change denial? And there's several aspects to that, and I'm sure it's quite a difficult, complex problem, because it dives into the human psyche and human psychology. In a book I can recommend with regards to psychology of climate change, it's also really small and short, so it's definitely a good read, is The Psychology of Climate Change. It's also on the slides down below, and you can find the link, the reference. So yeah, why is it so difficult to address? So there's this concept called tribalism, which is a term which refers to when people have to subscribe to an ideology, and that results in them automatically filtering out any information that goes against that subscribed belief. And that's obviously hugely problematic, because then there's no debate, and then there's no then whatever discussion comes out, or whatever new facts around climate change come up, people have already subscribed to the belief that climate change is a hoax, and then that makes it really difficult to address. And how do you speak to people who don't want to have that challenged, and who have also subscribed to an ideology that they're not open to discussion? And also what's really interesting to notice is that there was previously a much bigger consensus around climate change, especially I think in the 1970s, and especially also between different political parties. There was just a more united understanding of it, in terms of that there wasn't as much as a gap between people who believed and who didn't believe, and who believed that it's already happening. So for example, in 1997 in the US, 47% of Republicans and 46% of Democrats believed in that climate change was already happening. So yeah, that shows, it's a very marginal difference between the two, it's just 1%, whereas then in 2018, the number drastically diverged, with the number of Republicans believing that climate change is already happening dropping to 41%, and up to 76% of Democrats taking this position. So yeah, an increase in Democrats believing in in the fact that climate change is really happening, and then a drop in Republicans believing that, and that's kind of also shown the effect that conservative think tanks have had, and the effect that also that's had on actually splitting society and splitting us in our political system, which is very difficult, because regardless of political position and political parties, we should be treating climate change as a fact. It's something we need to address. And yeah, maybe we should have discussions around how we're addressing it and what is most effective. And obviously there's so many diverging opinions from that as well. But it's problematic that it's kind of diverged into political sides which are just not engaging in open dialogue and don't have and are not listening to scientific evidence. And it's very problematic. You know, we have such, I just wonder sometimes, we have such clever people in this world, and we've invented so many great things as humans and done so many good things, and then you look at international politics and leaders at the moment, and you just wonder, how did we get here? How can we make such stupid decisions if we have such clever people in this world? But if they're not being listened to, yeah. Another point that I want to mention before I go off on a tangent there is media impartiality. So media impartiality has been when media has kind of taken that stance to portray a story from two sides, which is fair enough. In many cases, you know, there's always a second side to a story, but it's usually problematic with issues and scientific problems and consensus around something like climate change. Because 99% of climate change scientists agree that climate change is real, it's human-induced, and it's threatening our survival. But then what's happened in the past is that media has given the other 1% of climate denier the same airtime and the space to talk and express their opinion as they've given climate scientists. And that's caused massive public confusion around climate change in the past, because it's made it seem like it's up for debate, which it is not. And that's difficult to address still, even though there's a growing movement, a growing awareness that, you know, there's really a problem and we need to do something. It's still very much rooted and it's difficult to address something like that. Now, the factor that makes it more difficult as well is, from a psychological dimension, is cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is a term that refers to a psychological tension between people's morals and their behavior. So that means that people change their beliefs to fit their behavior rather than the other way around. And I guess the whole difficulty around that is we live in a hugely complex world, in a world where it's difficult to live completely sustainable. Our day-to-day decisions are having an impact on the planet, whether we like it or not. And that's difficult because that causes that tension psychologically between we want to do good and we want to do the best that we can, but whatever we do it's going to have some impact. And that leads to difficult decisions in our day-to-day lives as well, because our systems are not rooted for sustainability to be the natural choice, which is where we should be going, but rather it's kind of an off-road almost. And that makes it difficult. So that's why it's psychologically easier for people to deal with such a complex issue through denial, rather than to recognize that there might be ethical concerns around it, and that's not ethical sound behavior in day-to-day lives, and that might lead to difficult lifestyle changes and decisions which are uncomfortable. But you know, we're living in uncomfortable times and we need to make some uncomfortable decisions, otherwise it will get more uncomfortable. And cognitive dissonance is definitely a difficult problem to address, because it's a way to ease the difficulty of the time that we live in, and to ease the difficulty within psychological tensions. But in the end, it's about climate justice, and we need to change the way we're living on Earth, and we need to drastically change that, and that will mean within each and every single one of our lives, things will need to change, and that might be uncomfortable. But we need to hold those accountable that are spreading false information and that are stealing our future, and that place profit and individual interest above people and planet. You know, as Greta Thunberg said in her famous UN speech, "How dare you?" You know, people are suffering, people are dying, and all you can think about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? And we really need to be aware that climate change is impacting people, the most vulnerable, the most. The less developed nations, women, children, us, you know, our future is at stake. And that's not fair. It's not fair to the way that our future and our world is being traded for short-term interest and for short-term profit. And we're not the only species on here. I mean, just taking human justice away from that, I mean, extending that to from a planetary level, and the amount of species extinction and the way we've really taken over the Earth. I mean, that's a whole nother justice dimension that we could dive into. And it's problematic, you know, that's why climate activists like myself are so frustrated and are speaking out about it, because even though it's increasing in the media and it's increasing public perception, climate change is not being treated like a crisis. And it's not. And that shows very evidently now in times like these, like the corona pandemic, because corona has been taken much more like a crisis than climate change is. Obviously because it's more immediate and it's taken us by surprise, which climate change is as well, because our global systems are not prepared for these large-scale global crises. So talking about COVID-19, fitting that into the context, our lives have changed in a way none of us saw coming, really. And even though people have talked about pandemics, people have talked about crises coming, and the possibility of pandemic, I mean, this has been discussed, this is not completely new. There's been people warning about how unprepared our health systems are for a while now. I mean, Bill Gates has mentioned it, other people have spoken about it as well already, but here we are and we were completely unprepared. We've talked about it, there's been simulations about it, and we were hit in the face by it. I mean, the global effects are, this has changed everything. And I mean, it's crazy to look at, you know, these empty streets and the way our lives have changed within just a couple of days and weeks. Wow. And I really want to frame as well, you know, how in what sense is COVID, you know, the climate virus, because it is part of the bigger planetary crisis. In its origin it is, because it relates to the way we as humans are abusing, are interacting with the planet, and then also further looking at how our environmental conditions are aggravating that, because in the end we can only be as healthy as our planet is, and if our planet is dying, then we can't survive either. And I think we're starting to realize that, but I really think we need to draw a stronger link between what's happening now as a crisis and how that's linked to the larger planetary crisis. I also recorded to dive deeper into how the origin of it and what it means for healthcare and healthcare system and a public health perspective on it, I recorded two podcasts, one in English and one in German, on how COVID is part of the bigger planetary crisis, which are linked here and which you can look at in your own time. But one thing that I also thought that was really important to mention was looking at air pollution. Because air pollution is actually responsible for over 8 million deaths every year. That's such a number, and I don't understand how we've not talked about this on a global scale and in media. I mean, we're talking about the corona related death on a daily basis and how it's changing from country to country, but we've not talked about air pollution and the effect that it's having, and that how much of a crime that actually is, that all these silent deaths that are just not being reported and it's not even given any consideration. And I think there's so much in our behavior that is truly criminal in terms of the way the world's interacting, in terms of what that means for our future generations, for children, for us as young people, as students, in The Guardian there was an article around how actually air pollution is likely to increase the coronavirus death rate. And that's because air pollution has a serious effect on your lungs, and this can worsen patients' survival chance and also increases the chances of the disease spreading, which is also that's something that's been recorded with previous corona outbreaks. So for example, data from the SARS outbreak in 2003 in China showed that people who lived in areas with places of a higher air pollution had a twice as high mortality rate as those with cleaner air. And that's something I think that we really also need to, as a global society, look into more and realize how our health and our planet are interlinked. And maybe that's a good narrative to move forward, because we need a new framing, a new global framing in terms of the planetary crisis, because it's not just our climate that's changing, it's our whole system, it's our whole Earth system. This world is so interconnected, and I mean, we see this now with globalization and the fact how corona spread literally to all parts and corners of the world and affected every single one in some way or another. So it's a shared global narrative, just as climate changes. And that's why it's a planetary crisis. It includes issues, the time we're finding ourselves include issues such as pollution, health, inequality, plastics, power politics, overconsumption. And as such, it's really a wicked problem. And like I said before, it's just COVID-19 really shows us how unprepared we are to tackle global crisis. And that brings me also to a framing, a political framing, which is important from an IR perspective, looking at how states are interacting, because I mean, obviously our states and our boundaries are human-created concepts, and yet we're interacting kind of as separate entities and think we can function on our own. And that goes back to the whole concept how Trump is envisioning his America First campaigns, and the rise in nationalism in general, kind of builds off the idea that we are separate and we can do without the other. But we're not. We are part of one interconnected global system, and that is something I think IR needs to pay more attention to. And that also, can be seen at times like these, because Trump announced to want to cut the World Health Organization funding, and then one of the responses from former UK Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt was, one of the biggest lessons from this will be that when it comes to health systems around the world, we are only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And that I want to send that to climate as well, and to our global system, not just health systems. We are only as strong as our weakest link and our weakest member, and we need international cooperation. We cannot deal with these global challenges alone. We need to look at them together, and that's the challenge of our century. How can we bridge all of these gaps and all of these created concept of our differences, to realize that we're one earth, and we need to look at these problems as one earth. So what does all of that mean for our future? You know, we really live in hugely disturbing and uncertain times, and it's difficult. It's difficult to think about. It's difficult from a well-being perspective as well, because these are challenges that individually we can't address, but they affect us individually, and that's difficult. And it calls us to envision a new earth. But you know, maybe this global pandemic is creating the paradigm shift that we've been waiting for, the global paradigm shift. You know, maybe it is. Maybe it's a wake-up call, which is kind of what I want to mirror a little bit of what Sir Ian Boyd said, who is a former chief scientific advisor to DEFRA, and is also now leading the environmental sustainability at St Andrews. And he wrote an article in Nature journal saying, like, highlighting, you know, how COVID-19 is bringing systemic change at a global level, and also highlighting how in the past, I mean, on a UK level, it's been talked about, like our health systems have been talked about, and the possibility of pandemics spreading out. It's been discussed, but it's not, yeah, like you say, we've practiced for a pandemic, but didn't brace. So, and that very much links to climate change. We're talking about this all the time. There's been simulations around it. We're looking at predictions. We're not preparing. And that's, and COVID is showing us the danger of not preparing. Yeah, and like Sir Ian said, we need to start planning and how we will rebuild, and how we will rebuild our systems into something more resilient that can deal with global problems, and global problems on a large scale, like climate change, that interact on many different levels, not just health, but so many different levels. So yeah, it's really only the beginning of a challenge, and it's up to us how we will use this time and this lesson. Yeah, we're at a crossroad. Either this is leading us down further crises, or it's leading us on a road to opportunity and to change. Because in the end, our global narrative is completely changing with COVID. Things are not going to be as before. I mean, just from a perspective that there's just been such a global disruption that they can't be. And we have this chance of either we're going to create more resilience and better systems that can deal with global crises and that can build a better future, or we going down further a road where this is becoming a norm. And that's not a world I want to live in, and I hope that's a world that none of us want to live in. So how can we steer down the road of change? I think it's hugely important to look at the economy, because economy is something that dominates our global political system, and our global thought processes, because it's actually crazy how much of our focus is just on the economic side of our world and of our human world, and the economic effects of the corona pandemic will be long felt and challenging. And so the question is, how do we move forward from that? And it's clear that we need to envision a radically different economy, because our economic system has failed us on so many different levels already. And we need to take into account a system, that considers planetary boundaries. Eternal growth on a finite planet is a recipe for disaster. And that's where I kind of want to refer to David Attenborough's quote. Anyone who believes in infinite growth on a finite planet is either mad or an economist. And I mean, wow, yeah. If you think about it, it makes so much sense. Why are we focusing our whole measures in our global societies are so focused on growth, and the whole concept of development is built so much on growth, rather than looking at how can we stay within the planetary boundaries and build a safe and just space for humanity, which is what I'm going to refer to the donut economic model, which was developed by Kate Raworth. Looking at, we have an environmental ceiling, and we have a social foundation that we need to consider. And we can't grow eternally. It just doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean we can't build and develop in some way. Development doesn't have to equal growth. Honestly, I can definitely recommend the Donut Economics book, which is 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. I haven't completely finished it, I have to admit, because I just started it, but I'm completely hooked, because such important topics to think about. And we need to also consider models and consider ways how we're going to envision the world. Because it's one thing talking about all the problems and what's wrong with the world, but it's quite another taking that step and seeing, well, how can we actually implement things that will work and that will change, and transform things for the better. So yeah. Finally, I also wanted to discuss the paper for the reading for this week, one of the readings anyway, which is Planet Politics, a manifesto from the end of IR. Really enjoyed this article, because it's challenged some of the ways that are usually, for me at least, very frustrating within IR, and really highlighted how we need to move beyond the mainstream way of how things are being done and framed within IR, and need to rethink and rewrite international relations. We need to create a space for interdisciplinary debate. And one of the crises is about mediating on our failures and finding the will needed for our continued survival. And let's not be fooled, this is about survival. We're all in this together, and we need to stop seeing ourselves as separate from the earth. And that's, I think, something that, as I mentioned before, that is very problematic within our current global political system, that we see as separate, and we see our state systems as separate, which they are, but they also human created, and in the end we're all living on the same earth, and we're all as vulnerable to some situations, like global pandemics. We are all vulnerable to them, and with climate change they will be increasing. So how do we address that? And how do we move beyond the mainstream theories and framings of IR? How do we ask uncomfortable questions and nurture more critical thought and more critical theories, and commit to a new planetary real? I really enjoyed this article. I'd love to discuss it further as well within our tutorial. So we cannot abandon our climate efforts now, because our survival depends on it. And that's a message that I want to stress. And that's also why Fridays for Future is taking up the initiative of the global digital climate strikes, which have been happening every Friday, encouraging people to post a picture with a poster. And that's my challenge, my task for you for this Friday, because it's a global digital strike, because obviously there can't be any in-person strike, because we're treating the crisis like a crisis and we need to practice social distancing. But we can't forget about the climate crisis, because our survival depends on it. We need to use this time to build something that can ensure our survival and that can ensure that we have systems that can respond to global challenges. So yeah, my challenge for you is participate this Friday in the global digital strike by either posting a picture of yourself with a poster, or just a poster leaning it against somewhere, maybe in your garden, or if you live in a space where people passing by the window, you can hang it against the window, a poster, just to highlight some awareness on the online climate strike and the fact that we cannot forget about the climate crisis, even in this time, especially not in this time, I would say. So, a new Earth. Whatever happens, this has completely changed the global narrative. And if that is for the worse or the better, that's for us to decide. It's definitely a wake-up call. A wake-up call that has cost lives, and we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of that social responsibility that we have. Because we've not created these global systems, have not cooperated, because we've engaged in the exploitation of our planet, that is why we are where we are now. And that is having a serious toll. And I think we need to be very, very clear of our responsibility to act. And whatever happens, we are at the standing at the edge of a new era. Not just a new century, but a new era, a radically different world. And it's kind of our choice what path we will go down. And we need to make sure that in a post-coronavirus world, and even, in a world that is dominated by the continuation of global pandemics or diseases which we can't address, we need to ensure that we have systems and that we have a healthy planet, because we can only, in order for us to be healthy, we need a healthy planet. A new Earth. What a time to live in. What a time to live in. Finally, I just wanted to give you some book recommendations to kind of look at these topics further. I've already listed some of them within the references. The Psychology of Climate Change, definitely a very short and small book, but very, very good. Definitely can recommend that. Secondly, The Introduction to Climate Change, Economics and Policy, which is actually co-authored by a professor emeritus in the School of Economics within St. Andrews. If you're interested in that sort of topic area as well, I did a radio show with him, so you can check on my podcast, Eco-Activist Journeys, if you're interested. And then, as I already mentioned, Donut Economics. I'm very excited to read this book further, and I definitely think something everyone should read, because economics are so important in our world, and we need to think about solutions and think about new ways how different things. So and then lastly, There's No Planet B. Love that book. Actually, I have it right here. I first listened to the audiobook, then I bought the book, And now I even have the German version of it, so it's very good. But just because it's quite comprehensive in terms of addressing all the different issues and giving insights and solutions on how we can look at this crisis, because in the end we need to realize that this is such an opportunity to create something better in terms of how our society works and how we interact with nature and addressing well-being. And yeah, we want to have a future on a habitable planet, on a healthy planet, on a planet where we can thrive on with beautiful nature. And this is such a special planet, and yeah, there's a lot to do, but if we all focus on something and take something forward, everyone does something that can create a ripple effect. So yeah, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you could learn something, take something from it. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, and discuss some of these topics further, because obviously this is a complex issue and there's so many different parts that play into it, so many considerations. I mean, who knows, we don't know what our future will bring. So yeah, it's a blank page, and the pen is ours. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is my bibliography. Take care and be kind.